Hello, this is Max. Today, I will tell you a story about a group of people who set out for a vacation, but everything turned into a tragedy for them. You can subscribe to the channel after watching. It helps us a lot in realizing the content. Two women flee from an unknown danger and are joined by a man named George. Tragically, the women fall into a pit, and George selfishly abandons them, focusing on his own survival. However, George becomes ensnared in a trap, hanging upside down. To his horror, a mysterious man with a dagger appears and eliminates George. Before these horrifying events, the European Sales Division of Palisade Defense, a military arms corporation, was in Hungary for a team-building excursion. Their path was obstructed by a fallen tree, prompting Richard, the manager, to instruct the driver to take an alternative route. Despite the driver's warning about its danger, Richard insisted and forced the driver to proceed. Frustrated, the driver unloaded their belongings and left them behind. Billy, Richard's secretary, suggested that the lodge they were heading to might be nearby, but the exact location was uncertain. Despite the lack of precise coordinates, Richard confidently asserted that it couldn't be more than a mile away. Harris, known for his stubbornness, considered returning to the hotel, but Richard convinced him to stay. As the group debated whether to continue toward the team-building lodge, the driver abruptly drove away with the bus, leaving them with no choice but to follow their original plan. Maddie cautioned the team to stick to the main road, but Richard disregarded her advice, insisting on taking a clear path. While venturing deeper into the woods, they heard a distressed sound from Steve, a member who had strayed from the group. Harris, Maggie, and Billy rushed to check on him and discovered him relieving himself. Steve claimed to have seen a masked man staring at him, but Maggie dismissed it as a hallucination caused by the magic mushrooms he had consumed during the bus ride. Unaware that he was urinating over a corpse, Steve continued his business. Later, the group stumbled upon a dilapidated building, which Richard mistakenly assumed was the lodge they were seeking. However, Jill pointed out that it didn't match the description of a luxury lodge mentioned in their memo. Despite this discrepancy, Richard tried to motivate the team while Steve, plagued by worsening hallucinations, left the room. Meanwhile, Harris and another member named Gordon searched the surroundings for a generator. Instead, Gordon discovered an abandoned pool and played on the diving board. Elsewhere, Harris came across a cellar containing cryptic Palisade documents written in Russian. Startled by a noise, he investigated and found a covered figure in the corner. Upon unveiling it, he realized it was merely a skeleton model. During the night, Richard awoke to noises in the hallway, sensing an intruder's presence. He followed wet footprints to a room and discovered Maggie on her bed, propositioning him for converge. Richard became flustered, but eventually accepted the offer. However, when Richard turned around, he was shocked to find Harris pretending to be Maggie. Filled with anger, Richard lunges at Harris, only to wake up and realize that it was all just a dream. During dinner, Harris shared a theory based on the documents he found. He suggested that they might be staying at an old asylum where, before the First World War, the inmates rebelled against the doctors and took control of the facility. Palisade was allegedly hired to eliminate everyone there, but one inmate supposedly survived and vowed to seek revenge against any Palisade employee. Jill initially dismissed the story as ridiculous but acknowledged that it had some basis in truth. Jill explained that in the early 90s, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, places like their lodge were used as detention centers for war criminals, including soldiers with a penchant for killing. While the governments of these criminals may have been responsible for their deaths, it was Palisade who supplied the weapons. To lighten the mood, Steve shared his own humorous version of the lodge's history from the 60s. He claimed it was once a hospital where nurses engaged in inappropriate activities with their patients, with a young man eventually becoming their idol. The men in the group found it amusing, but Jill merely rolled her eyes. Just then, Richard entered the room and became visibly nervous upon seeing Harris and Maggie together. Meanwhile, Steve discovered a human tooth in the pie served by Gordon, shocking everyone. Steve thought it was a gift from their boss, George, but it turned out to be an alarming and unsettling discovery. Later that night, while the others were asleep, Jill spotted a man staring at her through the window, causing her to scream and alert the rest of the group. She also claimed to have seen a masked man on a nearby tree. Concerned, Harris and Billy ventured outside to investigate, where they discovered metal ramps encircling the trees, facilitating easy climbing. After sharing their findings with the group, Jill insisted that they should leave and go home. However, Richard feared potential job loss if they abandoned the team-building process. He asked Jill to wait until the next day, and if she still felt the same, they would leave as she wished. The following morning, Jill remained resolute in her decision to leave, prompting Richard to agree to her request. He sent her and Harris to find cell service and arrange for transportation. Meanwhile, the rest of the team engaged in a paintball game. While Harris and Jill set off on their mission, they passed by the Palisade bus, which appeared to have crashed. Harris found the keys and went to search for the driver, only to discover him lifeless near the river. With a sense of urgency, Harris and Jill quickly boarded the bus and drove back to the lodge to inform the others about the crash. Meanwhile, Billy and Steve formed a team for the paintball game. While waiting for the perfect moment to ambush their opponents, Billy confessed his feelings for Maggie, but Steve believed she would never reciprocate his affections. Suddenly, someone passed by, prompting them to relentlessly shoot the person with paintballs. Later, they reunited with George and Maggie, realizing that none of them had been hit by paintballs, despite shooting the passerby earlier. Gordon joined the group and started talking about some of the unspoken rules, which led the others to playfully shoot him. This irritated Gordon, but as he walked away, he fell into a bear trap, causing severe pain. Billy and Steve tried to free him, but their attempts only worsened the situation, inflicting further agony on Gordon. Eventually, Gordon was left without a leg. While Maggie attended to Gordon, Richard and Steve noticed that the area was filled with bear traps. Suddenly, Harris and Jill arrived, stunned by the gruesome sight. They realized that the person who eliminated the bus driver was likely responsible for the bear traps. Deciding it was time to leave, the group gathered to carry Gordon back to the bus, with Steve placing his leg in a cooler in hopes of reattachment. They hastily made their escape, but someone dropped spikes on the road, causing the bus to crash. That night, Jill woke up and saw Harris lying on the ground. In her confused state, she walked past him and ventured deeper into the woods. Unbeknownst to her, a man appeared and eliminated Harris. When the rest of the group woke up, they were horrified by the sight of Harris' body. Billy suggested returning to the lodge, but Richard insisted on finding Jill before leaving. Carrying Gordon, the group set off, unaware that they had passed by Jill, who was tied to a tree near the road. After they had left, the masked man eliminated Jill. Upon arriving at the lodge, the group quickly locked themselves inside. As the night progressed, Billy excused himself to use the bathroom. In his absence, Maggie sat next to Steve, unaware that someone was dragging Gordon out of the room. When Billy returned, they heard Gordon's screams coming from the basement, leading them to discover a previously locked passage that had been opened. To their astonishment, they stumbled upon an underground prison, confirming Jill's earlier story. Filled with fear, Richard hurried back upstairs, while Maggie, Billy, and a hesitant Steve ventured forth to rescue Gordon. However, upon opening the door, they were confronted with the lifeless body of Gordon. The criminals swiftly fired at them, but Maggie and Billy managed to escape. Meanwhile, Steve retreated upstairs. Finding refuge in a nearby cell, Billy realized he had been shot in the chest. It didn't take long for him to succumb to his injuries, empowering Maggie with a determination for revenge. Armed with a machete, she stormed into the room where Gordon lay. Elsewhere, Richard fled into the woods in an attempt to save himself, but accidentally stepped on a Palisade landmine. Steve, on the other hand, hid from the roaming criminal within the house, while Maddie stealthily followed, plotting to eliminate him. However, she inadvertently fell through a broken floor, and the criminal aimed his gun at her. Just then, Steve attacked the perp, causing him to fall through the hole. Maggie seized the opportunity, grabbing the gun and liquidated him. Believing they were finally free, the two hurriedly exited the house, only to be confronted by the criminal's accomplices. With her last bullet, Maggie swiftly shot one of them, enabling her and Steve to flee into the woods. Racing through the darkness, they encountered Richard, who informed them that he had stepped on a Palisade landmine. Finding irony in the situation, Richard urged them to escape while he stayed behind and sacrificed himself. The criminals had intended to leave Richard alive to suffer, but fearlessly, he triggered the bomb, resulting in the deaths of two of the men accompanying him. Meanwhile, Maggie and Steve continued their escape, eventually finding the actual lodge they were supposed to stay in. Inside, they discovered Palisades CEO, George, along with two women named Nadia and Olga. Maggie and Steve explained their dire circumstances, urging George that they needed to escape. Coincidentally, George had brought along a new portable missile he had invented and decided to test it out on the criminals. However, the missile veered off course and struck a passing airplane, leaving the group with no choice but to run. In the ensuing chaos, Nadia and Olga became trapped, and George met a gruesome fate at the hands of the criminals. Meanwhile, Maggie became ensnared in a trap. Steve heard her cries, but before he could reach her, he was attacked by one of the criminals. Although he was able to defend himself, another attacker overwhelmed him. In another location, a different criminal attempted to take advantage of Maggie, but she bit his face in desperation. Despite his superior strength, Maggie fought back, using a rock to defend herself. Meanwhile, Steve regained consciousness and discovered a makeshift rope extending from a pit. Nadia and Olga had fashioned it using their clothes. In a separate turn of events, Maggie found herself being pursued by a criminal armed with a flamethrower. She stumbled upon the enemy's base and tried to make a phone call without success. As she left the room, she encountered the criminal, prompting her to flee in a panic. This led to a tense chase, and in an attempt to escape, Maggie leaped from the second floor, accidentally breaking her leg. Helplessly crawling away from her pursuer, she found herself saved when someone rained bullets upon the criminal. It turned out to be Nadia, with Olga and Steve by her side. Steve collapsed before Maggie, and they embraced each other while crying. The survivors then found a rowboat and made their escape through the lake. If you are interested in such films, please proceed to the next video on the screen, and also share your thoughts about this film in the comments. Give us a like and subscribe. Goodbye.